So this morning, thanks very much for having me. This morning I'm going to give you an extensive lecture on the extensive pre-Renaissance material written for the cello, which I'm not. You all know, of course, there's no real material written for the cello in pre-Renaissance. So, what I'm going to talk about is the sort of intersection of music and technology. And so I'm going to quickly start by playing a piece that was written for the cello when it was new, in 1720 something or other, early 1720s. So the interesting thing for me, when I started playing the cello and started learning about music, is that it's inherently uncool to play the cello, and that's the most interesting thing about it. But actually, the history of this stuff is really interesting. And so if you look at it, it's a kind of an oddly beautiful, slightly weird shape with all sorts of angles and stuff, and none of it's by accident. But I've never done a concert where the review has started with the intricate physics of the curvature of the bridge, or talked about the tungsten core of the strings, or about the micromillimeter depths underneath just there, which if you don't get right, just here, if you get wrong sound, it just doesn't work. And yet, whenever I do a concert with more stuff than this, the first two paragraphs talk about wires, laptops, computers, toys, things, shiny stuff. And there are kind of interesting problems with that, because that Bach cello suite, which is now canonized as this kind of thing that has always existed, which has only existed since 1720 something. I mean, there are bits of London older than that music, was written for a relatively new instrument, and the week before it couldn't have been done because the curvature on the bridge didn't exist. It was flat, or it didn't have enough strings, or it didn't have enough notes. And so these things have always happened. The evolution of music has always happened hand in hand with evolving instruments and evolving technology. And so I sort of got quite obsessed with this. And when I was at college, started working with the Media Lab at MIT in Boston to see where you could take the cello, or well, not just the cello, I just happened to be able to play the cello, where you could take musical control with a sort of slightly exclusive skill set that you've spent a while learning. So again, Bach, there's this sort of horseshit side of the profession which talks about authentic performance or historically accurate performance. And so technically I shouldn't be playing Bach like that, like this, with this in here. Authentic performance would say you play it on a cello without a spike, 100 years old. You wouldn't play it on a seat this height because you wouldn't have the spike, so you'd sit with it like this. You wouldn't play it in a room like this because they didn't have stuff like this, so the acoustic is wrong. And arguably you'd have to wear a wig. But actually the wig's really interesting because what it does, it changes the angle of your head, which changes the angle of your hand, which means you can't do certain things. It's actually really interesting in a very nerdy way. So, you get these kind of, they do have one kind of interesting point with that, which is that music was written with quite a specific sound, quite a specific set of tools in mind. And I mean, there are people, I had a teacher at college who would maintain that playing Bach on this cello, or this kind of a relatively modern instrument, is just as bad as playing it on a synthesizer. And, he's wrong, but whatever. But you get this interesting thing where it's the same people who talk about authentic performance who then go ahead and slate the use of auto-tune, or slate the use of guitars, or synthesizers, or computers, without really thinking that maybe that's authentic performance today. Maybe using computers and electronics and using evolving tools and evolving technology is the same as what Bach did. Again, they used to use gut strings, they now use steel. You couldn't have anything from, they were still using guts for a guy called Shostakovich in Russia in the 60s, 1960s. They used animal gut, right? And you're trying to fill a 5,000-seater hall with animal gut. It doesn't really work. So these things have always evolved, but it's the same people, like Americans who complain about immigration policy without really thinking they're probably second-generation American anyway. It's the same kind of problem. So, someone like will.i.am, who is pushing it at these sort of boundaries and doing interesting things with technology, maybe he is the 21st century Bach, I don't know, but he's doing sort of interesting stuff, and most importantly, he's capturing people's imaginations with tools they recognize. Most people don't really have the facility to talk about the intricate parts of this, but I bet you every single person knows what I've got on stage. Where if we did a little pop quiz about what's that bit called, I'm going to place my bets fairly high that I'm the only one that really knows. So the interesting and kind of important thing is cultural relevance. So whether the cello is or is not relevant in the 21st century isn't really the point of what I'm going to talk about. It's whether I, myself and others can bring it, sort of drag it kicking and screaming into relevance again. Because there was a point where it wasn't that it was classical music and Renaissance music and popular music and blah, blah, blah. It was just music, and that's what it was. And then we've got to these sort of interesting, strange points where everything's subcategorized and no one really thinks about the legacy that, in a Jessie J song or a Glee song that ultimately goes right the way back to madrigals. It's kind of interesting. So when I started looking into this and looking at how these things have evolved and where it's come from, where it's going, as I say, reviews are quite tricky to come by, which don't start talking just about wires and cables. And this I've got away quite lightly today. I reached my peak with 9 technicians once, and so it felt that was time for a change when there were 9 technicians and me. So a travelling party of 10 and only one of us making any noise. That felt wrong. And 40 speakers and stuff and lots of toys. But at that point, that's gone beyond the thing, and the thing in this case is the music. It's not about having cool toys and cool technology. It's about what music can you create with it. It isn't actually chicken or the egg. It's kind of actually you're there to create a piece of music. What's the most efficient and most interesting way of doing that? And so a lot of stage technology ends up being visual noise. So I then got to this point where I had pedals and boxes and things and 3 computers, which was quite fun. And it's this kind of elaborate visual noise that gets in the way. You start realizing when you're playing, sort of you're mucking around doing some noisy things, and then you think, oh God, I've got to press a button, I've got to do this. And again, it struck me that there's nothing in music that's binary. So as soon as you start working on a computer, it's on or it's off. It's one thing or it's another. Whereas with a piece of music, like that Bach cello suite, there's a G, a D, and a B. So you play the G, but then it's got a volume, it's got a pitch, it's got an intonation, it's got a place and time. It doesn't just simply happen. And so how could you start making contemporary music, sort of electronics and computer-generated and computer collaborative music? How could you make that musical? Could you make it musical? And if you could, would that be useful? And so I sort of got waylaid down this path of what would 21st century chamber music feel like if you weren't just sitting there telling the computer what to do at every turn? What if you weren't just saying, next, next, next? If you're playing a Beethoven piano sonata, cello sonata, you're not sitting there sort of going, next key, next page. It's understood. The control of that piece is sort of baked into the music. It's coded into the thing that you're both trying to achieve. The common goal has everything written into it. And so at that point, it's the music serving music and not the music serving technology. Again, piano is incredibly complicated and relatively modern. And, as sort of touched on at the beginning, having spent sort of 25ths of my life playing the cello, I would probably like to think I've got enough vaguely refined control to make decisions about what I'm doing above and beyond just one thing or another. I'd like to think there's some level of kind of finesse. That we're asking, so we go up on stage and play with things that make you round to the lowest common denominator, as opposed to opening up a whole new level of collaboration. And so I started wondering if you changed the terminology from I'm a performer and I've got a problem to I'm a player, I've got a problem. The exciting developments I've been seeing and hearing about friends who are developers have been coming from the gaming world. They've not been coming from the music world, not directly. So all the kind of interesting games that I got interested in that actually bizarrely did come from the Media Lab, like Guitar Hero or the Wii, Connect, all these sorts of things of gestural control, using natural gestures to do really elaborate things that give you a much deeper sense of connection with what you're doing, are on the surface coming from the gaming world. A lot of them use music as an early prototype, but directly they're sort of games. So I started wondering what if you started asking game questions, rather than saying, I'm going to play this beautifully canonized piece of music and it's going to last this long and it's going to start at the beginning and end at the end. What if you treated it a bit more like a game? What if you needed non-sequential access to it, which we do when we're practicing? What if you're going to want to change it or respond differently to something, which you do if you've got an opinion about it? How does that work, and how do you bring that into this kind of slightly slowly moving, slightly dry side of the world called the classical music industry? So I started looking for game developers I could work with, as opposed to just composers and other kinds of techie people. So I started looking for gaming people. And a couple of years ago, 3 or 4 years ago, found RJDJ. Do we all know RJDJ? iPhone app? So RJDJ is like the most incredible thing. It's a bit, I know most people think it's a bit like, it creates an ambient soundtrack and it's a bit whatever. But what it's proving is your phone can tell you what key the world is in and at what speed it's moving. That is actually really complex. Like, that's amazingly complex. What it's doing is abstract pitch and rhythm detection. None of this, until very recently, could do that on stage live. So I had to tell it everything in advance. My phone could do that. Now there's something wrong there when my phone is more musical than my arsenal of crap at home. Thousands, in fact, tens of thousands of pounds worth of outboard gear that doesn't know what note I've just played. That's kind of wrong. So what if we started, rather than treating performance music like it's got a legacy, like it's going to live for 500 years, and assume it's going to live in a kind of museum, what if we put it back into the present tense and thought, what would make it relevant to people today? What about using the tools that people use today? So I went off and found me some people from RJDJ. And we started talking about how you could you actually make it accurate enough and controllable enough? The great thing with RJ is that it's kind of ambient and lovely. Could you actually have really powerful, discrete control? What would you actually be triggering? How would you actually be triggering it? Like, it's one thing for it to hear the train rumble and go, but if you're playing a piece of, I don't know, Steve Reich, big American composer, if you're playing a really tight rhythmic piece, what's it actually going to do? And why is that better? Why is it preferable to that than just hitting play? And sort of got back to this point of it's about the present tense, it's about actually having a fail rate. There's something quite exciting about it could all go really, really badly wrong. And that's quite exciting. If you're playing with a backing track, you're playing like these looped up pieces, creating large textures. The perfect performance of that, the ideal performance of that is indistinguishable from a recording. Why not just use it? Why not just mine? Why not just use a backing track? And so I never really told anybody this before, but I then did a series of concerts across about 3 months where I did exactly that, just to see if anybody noticed. No one did. I was like, well, that's a bit boring. It was boring for me. It was kind of the same for them. So why? It wasn't the whole program. It was just one piece. Let's get this clear from the beginning. I mimed one piece. I lip-synced one piece, but I did it well. I have an electric cello as well, which is like this blue stick. It's got a computer in the bridge and in the this bit, and yeah. So I generally use that for getting away with really far out there things. But then kind of learned that when I use that and assume that I can get away with more, actually people assume it's doing more than what I'm doing, and my ego doesn't really deal with that very well. So you kind of have to get the priorities right. So I'm back at this one now for the moment. And so if people can't tell the difference and it's boring for me, why not give them something? Why not play something that is clearly there and then, something that's really happening, really, really working, and really does go wrong, and has in fact gone spectacularly wrong recently. So we started looking at it and started looking into what you would need, and you sort of think, you assume that music's this amazingly complex thing. It is, there's a lot going on, but you're starting from a really good point. I'm yet to meet anybody that doesn't like music. Has anyone ever met anyone that doesn't like any kind of music? Ever? So I personally haven't. I might just be like Rose. You've met someone who doesn't like any kind of music? What's the story?
He just listens to news on the radio.
Wow.
He hates music.
Is that George Alagai? No. That's nuts. Oh shit, that whole story's gone. I now know I've met someone who knows someone who doesn't like music. Damn. I'm going to take that back. I'm yet to meet anybody. And that is true. So that never happened. I'm yet to meet anyone that doesn't like any kind of music. Bloody hell. And the kind of the genre agnostic thing is quite important, I think. I actually don't listen to classical music very much, if at all. I quite like going to concerts, but I don't listen to it on my iPhone or on computer at home. I don't listen to very much of that. And the honest truth of my playlist is so embarrassing and so shocking that I don't think you actually want to hear about it. but it does involve a lot of glee, and it involves, right now, quite a fair amount of Nicki Minaj. So there's, but it's really well made. Like, on the plus side, it's really well made. So yeah, sidetracked. Anyway, so people generally don't not like music. So what is it about it that they like? And how can you harness that into removing the control from the front end of, look at all this stuff I've got and look at all this augmented control, to putting it into the back end, and so you don't see it. All the control of Beethoven, Brahms, Mozart, the whole canon of it, everything is baked into the music. You don't speak, you don't talk, and you don't do anything other than just play. And that's remarkably cool. Like, that's really cool. From the same mindset that looks at this as a piece of technology, that's a really cool piece of code. And we have moved so far away from that by overcomplicating the front end, and we forgot about the back end. So trying to find new tools today, or make new tools today that make it possible to bring that side up to date. I'm a little bit off relearning a whole other instrument, so for now I'm sticking with the cello. It's also suitably inconvenient to travel with, so I can complain about stuff. But the control has been written into an iPhone app for me. I'm not going to use it on my iPhone this morning, because this is the first time I've actually used it on stage. This is a piece of software called Go Play, which is the fruits of really sitting down and working out what it is about music that is powerful, and what it is that we need to make music. And unfortunately, the answer is actually super simple. It is pitch. Pitch is the one control element that we listen to in a Beethoven sonata, in a Brahms symphony, in Mahler. That's the one thing that leads you from if this to then that. You've got rhythm as well. Rhythm's fine, but you can get quite complicated with rhythms. If you can harness the power of pitch, like the actual control of the thing that's being played, again, I'm going to be careful with what I say, but we're yet to find a piece which this doesn't work for. But I'm sure your friend's going to find the shipping forecast or something. So I've spent the last little bit, a couple of weeks ago, developing this software where the initial proof of concept was, could I produce something which would otherwise be quite complex with a looping pad, with a floorboard, an 8-button floorboard, which you'll see if you go and see any kind of rock gig, any pop show with a guitarist. They've all got one of these things. It's got like 2 faders on it, 2 little foot faders, and 8 buttons or 10 buttons, whatever. This was written to equal and then hopefully surpass an 8-button foot pedal. And what was really interesting, the number of big heavy tech projects with big heavy tech companies that I've done, where you spend months problem solving and then spend a weekend writing some music. We spent a weekend solving the technology and then a week pissing about with music. So it feels like this really vibrant point where the technology's gone so far, it's gone so big and so complicated that we now can actually simplify it. We can bake it right back into the bit that everyone actually wants to hear, because everyone likes music. I've written this kind of little soaring platitude as my introduction, that by treating technology as the efficient way to recreate something you can already do, we sort of lost the way of curiously just fiddling and finding out. And one requires hours on the clock, and there's nothing wrong with that. But the sort of passion and curiosity that leads to sort of inquisitive design is really infectious. And that's the thing that I think we've lost in the music industry, is the ability to sell the passion in kind of creativity, in creating the stuff. And it's all about just mechanical delivery. And so hopefully it's a bit of a lofty goal, but hopefully something like this will at least be asking the right kind of questions, or an appropriate kind of question. So without further ado, I'm going to put my little microphone on. But yeah, this might look, I have a suitcase with me for this stuff, but the number of things for which this is in itself a measurement of progress for me, that I don't have someone else doing this. Say it does actually run on an iPhone as well, but that felt like a little stage too far. So what this is going to do, I'm going to play a simple piece. Oh, easy now. And what's going to happen is the notes that I play are going to trigger effects like a certain sequence of notes is going to start a loop, short-term loop. Another sequence of notes will stop that loop and bring it back in. A bottom C, the lowest note on the cello, will bring the loop that I've just recorded into time and put a pulse on it. I can then do whatever I want. Another note will load a pre-recorded piece of material, and then I do whatever I want. And then another sequence of notes brings back the thing from before. So it's going to start feeding back in a second. So kind of non-sequential access, which is the all-important thing. And then another note will finish it, and we can all have some more coffee. Okay. So this is called Go Play.
Before we have questions, I'm not sure about you guys, but I felt like I've just witnessed something just like pure magic. That was absolutely incredible. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
That's really great. You will have another clap at the end. You were thinking along the same lines, I could see that. Okay, so who's got some questions, or have people got questions? Yes, over there. Do you consider the failure rate of yourself and the technology as part of the aesthetic of what you're creating?
I think when I talk about a failure rate, I'm meaning the incentive to get it right, rather than the kind of adoration of getting it wrong. I think it's more about actually not just being able to call one in. It's responding to variables, and that's kind of what makes it fun, rather than keeping the challenge kind of ticking along. This is probably more about making a circle from a million straight lines than making a square. Do you know what I mean? It's like it's using the same stuff to make it feel organic. This uses like a really super advanced version of the thing that makes Will.i.am sound cool when he sings. Like, it basically uses auto-tune to know what I'm doing. It's not auto-tune, but it's similar. So it's just using it in a slightly different way, I guess. I like the idea of millions of straight lines making a circle. So I got into sort of electronics thing because that kind of sound world is what was relevant to me when I was growing up. You don't hear very much Debussy on TV. You hear a lot more kind of electronic stuff. It's like, well, how's that sound created and how can I do it? Like that kind of curiosity of, like, I'm really interested in sound. I love playing the cello, but I'm less fascinated by the cello than I am by sound.
Right, so it's about the sound.
Yeah,
right.
And how you go about creating and controlling that. So this is like effectively an interface. So I can play this.
Yeah.
But it gives me which is a start. It's like a start for 5 points, right? But in and of itself isn't the thing. The thing is the thing that you play. And I wanted to move beyond just playing. Like, I didn't particularly fancy being just another piece in a museum. Playing 300-year-old music on a 200-year-old instrument for a 100-year-old audience. It's not.
Interpretation, isn't it? Maybe this is
now there's an interesting point there.
It's about interpretation, isn't it?
It is and it isn't. If you want to get future bookings, it definitely isn't.
Right.
You cannot get, if you go, basically we end up being really, really well-trained cover acts. So there's a version of the Elgar Cello Concerto, and if you don't do it like that, why didn't you do it like that? There are Bach cello suites, and then there are Bach cello suites. There are this and this and this. If you go too far beyond that, there is a degree of variability, but if you go too far beyond it, it's like, what are you doing? You never really leave that grading system of 75 out of 100, well done. 4 stars. You just change the vocabulary. Whereas if you don't entertain that side of the industry, that's the side of the industry that's got problems. My side of the industry is great. Like, it's great fun. And that in itself is a modern thing. When Bach wrote those, he didn't expect them to have a legacy. Like, we're now assuming a legacy. That's why he wrote so much stuff. It wasn't because he was super awesome. It was because he had a weekly commission and had to write so much stuff. And Bach wasn't played after he died. It was Mendelssohn in 1840 something that brought him back. Like, he literally hadn't been played after 1750 when he died. Like 100 or something years. And to us now, that feels weird. But on the other hand, there was no such thing as legacy music. It was always new, and it was always done. Like, most of the operas that the Royal Opera House do were written before that building was built. So it's like, what's the purpose of the kind of the silo of it? So getting into the electronics thing it sort of legitimised my interest in not just doing Bach or Beethoven.
So sorry, I was just going to ask, to that point about legacy music, why has that music become legacy music, and the stuff that we're seeing produced, say, over the course of the 20th century, in pop music, for example, doesn't seem to have the same kind of longevity?
Well, it's a different time scale.
Yeah.
I mean, looking at, Bach is still dead, right? So in 1750, when he stopped writing, a fair amount of stuff's happened since then. Like, our ears have become accustomed to different things, and that feels, it's beautiful. It is like unashamedly beautiful music. But they had a far more rigid compositional thing. Like, they couldn't do this because they'd be excommunicated. Like, they would be thrown out. They were all employed by the church then. The patron was, and that was the demonic interval. You couldn't do it. So, whereas if you look at the Shostakovich cello concerto, it starts with that. Like, he'd be out. Yeah, I think, it's what your ear is used to.
Yeah.
A lot of, so much pop music today uses the fourth, like, for example, this kind of, like the Red Hot Chili Peppers, all these sort of things. But Glee, they all use the fourth. And the fourth, it's like musical fashion through musical identification. It's like the fourth was massive in madrigal times, like huge in the early Renaissance, because it didn't have any major or minor connotations, like a major third or a minor third. The fourth, it's like, it doesn't have a pure harmonic function. And so it was used a lot, and so open fifths. And they've all gone, you can chart the history of this stuff. It's really interesting, like they go in kind of fashions. Fourths are huge right now because auto-tune can round them perfectly. It's called a perfect interval. So I'm deadly serious. So is everywhere because you can make a computer do it. I'd love to get some categorical proof on that, but I just don't believe it's not. But yeah, so intervals and intervallic things. So Bach was writing at a time where the major third was totally cool. And the whole thing, even the sad movement starts like that. But that's just nice. And that's sad. It's like, and I think it just sort of got a bit grittier. People used to write really, like Wordsworth wrote these lovely little kind of love poems, like la-da-da-da-do. And then you've got like Irvine Welsh. You've got kind of their differences in how people use language that have evolved and what you can get away with. And also, who's commissioning it is important. Yeah. If you're writing something for the glorification of God / the Prince, it's going to be different to writing it for EMI. It's going to have a different function. Yeah. But I think, it's a different question about like pop music versus something that is like 250, 300 years old. Listening to music from the turn of the century, like the 1900s, sounds pretty melodic and rosy. But then if you listen to some other stuff, like a few years later, right on that cusp, it's mental, like properly mental. And even now, it's still seen as, oh, isn't this nice to hark back to the good old days of loveliness? And yet it is actually, under the cover, quite weird. Yeah. So I think it's relative to, I don't think we're going to enter another time. I don't think the music that's written today will necessarily be listened to in 300 years' time. So I don't know that it's a fair, I don't think we're never going to know, is the honest answer. Yeah. Unless someone makes a way of Spotify future playlists.
How much of what you've done so far has come just out of kind of an inherent curiosity, I guess? And do you have an idea of what you're aiming for, what you want to achieve with your work?
Well, I think the first thing, obviously, to do is respond with a quote. And so J.R. Tolkien's "All who wander are not lost." So there is a kind of a vague, there is an underlying thread to that which I do, and the only real common point is actually a cello and me, but it's not going to play itself. So the sort of common thread would be a cello. It's finding relevant ways of it's going to sound really glib, I don't mean it quite like this, but relevant ways of making myself employable. It's finding ways of making this relevant. Like, I when I was younger and not younger, but a couple of years ago, really enjoyed just sort of sitting around and pissing about and seeing what you could do with it. And there was no direct payoff for it, but shameless plug, I just finished recording an album, which comes out next week, which uses uses so much of that. It's not like when I started my career, I was a junior associate cellist, and then went to a junior analyst cellist, and then went to being like I don't know, what's the next one? Analyst cellist, and so on. There's no real structured progression. So I sort of judge progress by how much I can get away with, like how much I can get away with, and how far I can go with that. So I think this one was quite fun, and it's come out remarkably well. I actually put my hand through the front of my cello recently, just down here, because I'm not going to. Am I going to do it? I'm going to do it. If you do this, you get a really good kick drum sound, right? So there's actually, you can just see it. There's a line. It just went. So this recording, it's a sort of using a cello, fully acoustic cello, to imitate kind of retro electronica from like late 80s, early 90s, and had to learn how to play like a stutter drum on the cello and like glitches, and it's really weird. It doesn't sound like that. It sounds quite cool. Actually, I could play some. But it's a kind of, I would say it's curiosity-led rather than I want to play to a bigger venue. I mean, the kind of the surface level is you get bigger audiences and people fly you and put you in nicer hotels. Like, that's a nice-ish surface measurement. In my experience, the kind of the metrics thing doesn't really align with the kind of not the quality of the work, but the kind of inherent interest of the work. So some of the most sort of interesting stuff I've done, I've played to like 7 people, and some of the most lucrative stuff I've done, played to several thousand people. And I know which I'd rather do. You do have to do both. But, there is from a sort of, I compose as well, and my interest in composition is more how you can kind of create big sounds and create kind of interesting stuff that uses systems like electronic systems. So I've just finished a big data sonification, which is a real thing. So turning a live data set into music. So decided to do it's effectively the sound of Twitter. So it's a live Twitter stream, and it creates a 6-month-long piece of music from what people say, how they talk about it, where they talk about it, and then it orchestrates it into a symphony orchestra, which is real people playing. And they're sitting in a little room somewhere, like 24 hours now, recording a symphony orchestra, and then it triggers its algorithmic composition. But this might be quite loud. Let's play a quick bit of this thing. So this is a straight-up cello. There's no electronic processing on this. This is written by Gabriel Prokofiev, who's Sergei Prokofiev's grandson, who's a DJ, fascinatingly. For 9 cellos, it's all me. All this. And so on. So just sort of trying to find new ways of creating new sound through a cello, because it's it's got limitations. Like this one's got 4 strings. It's made out of wood. You can't do too much to it, but you can create some absolutely amazing sounds from it. And it's not just about, which in its time was a pretty imaginative use of the instrument, but that's no reason why that's where it should stop. So, yeah, there's no kind of I want to be the CEO, the chief executive cellist, but at the same time, it's kind of, it's just sort of pushing at things that seem interesting. And I was saying to Drew earlier on, the interesting problem with being a cellist is that the booking cycles are astronomically irrelevant. So, like, if you want to actually have a career, realistically, you have to be booked like a couple of years in advance. Like the venues and promoters and things book years in advance. So through my slight arrogance of doing new stuff, I've managed to bring that down to a year, but it does limit what you can do. Like, I can't go and play some traditional festivals because 2015 is not a relevant number for me. I've got friends who know what they're doing till 2016, 2017, like who know what they're doing. And like that doesn't seem relevant. Like, I don't know, I commission quite a lot of music, and I've got a series of concerts in like October, November. I actually don't know what the music is yet. I know I've got the bookings to play it, but the pieces haven't been written. And that's interesting, like that's fun. And it keeps it fresh, it keeps it, like there's something to do, as opposed to, yes, and today I'm going to do another Sibelius, I'm going to do this, and blah, 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 blah. It's not, as long as I can make it not be feeling like a job, I'm going to be thrilled.
I think, yeah, okay, I'm quite happy that we managed to book you at 3 months' notice then.